In Bath that winter, a woman's choices were not really choices at all. They were the options remaining after the men in her life had eliminated everything else. Harriet Thorne was a ward, a musician, and a woman who had spent 3 months quietly trying to buy back her guardian's debt from the man who held it, without telling her guardian, without telling anyone. Teaching piano to the daughters of anyone who would pay, and keeping the accumulated sum in a locked box in her wardrobe and watching it grow too slowly. Augustus Prynne held the debt. Prynne wanted a wife of sufficient standing to open certain social doors, and Harriet's standing was sufficient. And so he had come to an arrangement that Harriet had agreed to in December because she had run out of other arrangements. And her guardian was not well, and she could not watch him broken by a man like Prynne over a sum she had been 2 months from assembling herself. She was nearly there. She was 2 months away. When the steps of St. Swithin's were frozen on the morning of the formal announcement, and she went down hard, and the man who caught her was Edmund Steyne, Viscount Ashwick, her guardian's named enemy. The last person she would have chosen, he asked her, not whether she was all right, but whether she was hurt. The difference between those two questions was the size of the entire problem. Then he made a decision in the next 30 seconds that no one in that churchyard had anticipated. What she did not know was that he had already made a different and more consequential decision 3 weeks before, and that she was going to have to find that out herself. The steps of St. Swithin's had been swept that morning, which was the kind of detail that made what happened afterward feel like a particular cruelty. Someone had done the correct thing, and it had not been sufficient, because the temperature had dropped again in the hour between the sweeping and the arrival of the Vane party, and the stone had re-iced in the thin, nearly invisible way that stone does when the conditions are exactly wrong. Harriet felt it the instant her left foot landed the absence of resistance, the world sliding out from under the careful arrangement she had made of herself, and then she was falling, and there was nothing to catch on. And she had a single, clear thought, which was that this was a very bad morning for this to happen. And then someone caught her. She knew, before she looked up, that it was not Prynne. She knew by the quality of the catch, quick, braced. A person who had been watching the steps and seen the moment coming before she had. Prynne was not the kind of man who watched steps. She looked up. Edmund Steyne, Viscount Ashwick, was looking down at her with the expression of a man who has just made a rapid assessment and is waiting for additional data before concluding it. He was 34. She knew from the legal documents Sir Francis kept, though the documents had not prepared her for the quality of his attention, which was the kind that did not move to the next thing until it had finished with the current one. He said, very quietly, so that it did not carry to the people behind them on the steps, "Are you hurt? Not are you all right? Not good heavens. Miss Thorne." The specific question, asked because he wanted the specific answer. She took a breath. She moved her left wrist, which had taken the partial weight of the fall, before his arm had caught the rest of it. Something in the wrist protested. Not sharply, but insistently. "My wrist," she said. "Not badly." He nodded once. The nod of a man logging confirmed information. He did not release her arm. He looked, for one moment, to his left, and she followed his gaze and saw Augustus Prynne standing 2 steps above them, watching, with the expression of a man who has calculated that moving forward would require him to interact with Edmund Steyne and has decided, in the time it took Harriet to fall, that he would rather not. Prynne was a man who managed risk. Steyne was a risk he had not priced correctly, and his stillness on the steps was the stillness of someone recalculating. What happened next took perhaps 30 seconds and altered the social landscape of Bath for the remainder of the season. Steyne straightened, bringing her upright with him, and turned to address not Prine, but the general company on the steps, which included the Reverend Dunnet and 4 members of the Vane social circle and a woman from the lending library who would have the story at 3 separate tea tables before the afternoon was out. He said, in the carrying voice of a man who understood that the audience was present whether or not he acknowledged it, Miss Thorne has injured her wrist. She will need to go home directly. I will see her to her carriage. He looked then at Prine, for exactly as long as was necessary, and no longer. I will take her to Vane House. You have my word on it. Prine had 2 options. He could object, which would require him to outspeak a viscount in a churchyard in front of 30 witnesses while his betrothed was standing with an injured wrist. And the social arithmetic of that was straightforwardly ruinous. Or he could accept, which gave Steyne 15 minutes in a carriage with his betrothed, and the social inference that he had permitted it. Prine looked at both options with the speed of a man who was very good at looking at options, and he inclined his head, which was neither agreement nor refusal, and was therefore, in practice, agreement. Steyne's carriage was on the far side of the churchyard. She walked beside him across the frozen ground, and she did not take his arm because her wrist hurt, and because taking his arm in a churchyard in front of 30 witnesses was a statement she was not prepared to make, and he did not offer it, which told her he had done the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. They walked the 40 feet in silence. He handed her into the carriage with the hand that was not her injured side, and then he got in himself and sat across from her, and the door closed and the carriage began to move. She looked at her wrist, which had begun to swell slightly at the outer edge. She looked at the carriage interior, which was plain and well kept, and had a rug on the seat beside her that she had not been offered and was not going to take. She thought about the steps and the recalculation on Prine's face and the 30 witnesses and what the story would look like by 3 o'clock. And then she made herself stop thinking about that because she could not manage it from inside a moving carriage, and it would still be there when she arrived. Steyne was looking at the window. He said, without turning, "You should put the wrist up, against the seat back." She considered this. It was practically correct. She shifted and rested the wrist against the padded back of the seat, and the pressure eased slightly. She said, "Thank you. For the wrist or the steps?" "Both," she said, "though I would have preferred to manage the steps myself." He turned from the window then. He looked at her with the same quality of attention as on the steps, not performing attention. "Simply paying it," he said. "I know." She held that for a moment. It was not the answer she had expected, which she understood was because she had been expecting either an apology or a justification, and he had offered neither, which was a third option she had not fully priced. She said, "Then why?" He looked at the window again. Because Prine was not going to move. He said it with the flatness of a man describing a fact about the weather, and the alternative was leaving you on the steps. You could have called for someone else. There was no one else close enough. He paused. Also, I did not want to. She looked at the side of his face and thought about what that sentence contained, and decided not to examine it too closely in a moving carriage with her wrist up against the seat back. She said, "Sir Francis will not be pleased to see you at the door." "No." He said it without apparent concern, which was either confidence or a very good performance of it. "That is a secondary problem. It is not secondary to Sir Francis. I am aware of that." He turned back. "Will you tell him what happened?" "I will tell him the true version," she said, "which is that I fell and you were close. That is the true version." "Yes." She looked at the wrist. "It will not stop him from drawing other conclusions." "No," he agreed. "It will not." She thought about the 30 witnesses and the lending library woman, and the story that was already being told in the 3 or 4 versions it would take before it settled into a fixed form. She thought about Prine's stillness on the steps and the calculation behind his inclined head. She said, "You have complicated my situation." He said, "After a moment, your situation was already complicated." She looked at him. He was looking at the window again, and she could not tell from the angle whether this was observation or avoidance. She said, "Do you know what my situation is?" He did not answer immediately. The carriage turned onto the Vane street and slowed for the gate, and in the pause between the turn and the stop, she watched his face and tried to read what was in it, and could not. "Quite," he said, as the carriage came to rest, some of it. Beale, Sir Francis's butler, opened the door before they had fully stopped, which meant someone from the churchyard had gone ahead, which meant the story was already moving faster than she had hoped. Sir Francis appeared in the doorway a moment after Beale, still in his indoor coat, and his face went through the particular sequence of a man confronting an unexpected development recognition of Steyne, consternation, control, and the papering over of the consternation with social form. He said, to Harriet, "My dear girl," and then stopped, because looking at her wrist and at Steyne and at the carriage and assembling the picture was taking a moment longer than the social form allowed for. Steyne handed her out. He said to Sir Francis, in the same carrying and direct voice he had used in the churchyard, "Miss Thorne's wrist needs ice and rest. She took the fall on her left side. I do not believe it is serious." He looked at Sir Francis, and something passed between them. Not warmth, not its opposite, something older and more complicated than either, and then he said, "Good day, Sir Francis," and got back into the carriage. She watched the carriage go from the doorstep of Vane House with Sir Francis's hand at her elbow and the December cold at her back, and thought about his answer, some of it, and about what some of it meant, and about what the rest of it was, and about the particular way a man does not answer a question when he knows the answer and has decided, for reasons of his own, that today is not the day. She thought, I need to know the rest. Sir Francis did not ask about Steyne that evening. He asked about the wrist which Beale's wife had wrapped in a cold compress and which by dinner time had reduced to a dull, manageable ache, and he asked about the steps, and whether she had been frightened, and whether she needed anything. He did not ask about the carriage or the 15 minutes or what had been said inside them, which was the kind of not asking that was itself a statement. Sir Francis was 61, and he had been Harriet's guardian since she was 14, and he had learned, over 8 years, that there were things she would tell him when she was ready and things she would not tell him at all, and that pressing the difference produced neither result faster. She was grateful for this. She was also sitting across from him at the dinner table with the compress on her wrist and the candles between them, aware that there were things she had not told him that he deserved to know, and that the accumulation of those things was becoming a weight she was not certain she could continue to carry in the direction she was carrying it. She had not told him about the locked box in her wardrobe. She had not told him about the months of piano lessons and the careful accounting and the conversation with Kessel in November, when she had gone to the moneylender's office in the lower part of the city and explained, with the precision of a woman who had prepared her words in advance, that she wished to purchase a specific debt and what she was prepared to pay for it and when she could pay it. She had not told him that Kessel had said the sum was close but not sufficient, and that she should come back in 6 weeks. She had not told him any of this because telling him would have required explaining that she knew about the debt. And she knew about the debt because she had found the relevant correspondence in a folder he had misfiled, and had read it before she understood what she was reading. And by the time she understood, she had been carrying the knowledge for 2 weeks and had decided the most useful thing she could do with it was solve it rather than confess it. She had not, in the end, solved it. Prine had moved faster. After dinner, she went to the music room, because the music room was where she went when she needed to think without appearing to think, and because Sir Francis understood that she went there and did not follow. The piano at Vane House was a good instrument, older than she was, and tuned every 6 months by the same man who had tuned it for 30 years, and she sat at it and did not play, only rested her good hand on the keys without pressing, and listened to the particular silence of a room that was made for sound, and currently without it. She thought about Steyne's face in the carriage. She thought about some of it, and about what the sum was and what the rest was, and about the fact that a man who was her guardian's named enemy had caught her on iced steps and driven her home, and handled Sir Francis at the door with more tact than she would have predicted from a man described in the household as a person of intractable opposition. She had read the correspondence about Steyne, too, when she had found the misfiled folder. The history between him and Sir Francis went back 11 years, to a business arrangement that had collapsed in a way that both men described, in their respective correspondence, as the other man's fault, and which Harriet, reading the letters carefully, the thought was probably nobody's fault in the sense of deliberate wrongdoing, but rather the fault of 2 men who had different ideas about what an agreement meant, and had not established the terms precisely enough at the outset. The letters had grown colder over the years. The final one, from Sir Francis, had contained a phrase she remembered: "I consider the matter closed, and the acquaintance equally so." Steyne had not replied. She was still at the piano, her hand still on the unplayed keys, when she heard Sir Francis come to the doorway, and then, after a moment, go away again. She was grateful for that, too. The following morning brought 3 notes of inquiry about her wrist from people who had been at St. Swithin's, one from Susanna Crawley, her closest friend, who had not been at the churchyard but had heard about it by 8 in the morning, which was the speed at which Bath moved when the information was sufficiently interesting, and one from Prine. Prine's note was 4 lines, correct in form, and without a single word that could be objected to, and she read it with the attention she gave to documents. She was not certain she trusted, and found nothing actionable in it and nothing warm. She wrote back in kind. Susanna came in person at 11, which was Susanna's preferred method of communication for anything she considered too important for paper. She was 25, the same age as Harriet, with the particular quality of a woman who was interested in everything and had the social manner to make her interest seem like attentiveness rather than inquiry. She sat in the parlor chair with her coat still on and said, without preliminary, "Tell me the true version." Harriet told her the true version. Susanna listened with the focused silence of someone recording rather than reacting, and when Harriet finished, she said, "He asked if you were hurt." "Yes. Not if you were all right." "That is what I said." Susanna looked at the window. She said, "That is a meaningful distinction." "I know it is." Prine didn't move. Susanna said it the way she said things that mattered, which was quietly and without inflection, as if the flatness of the tone would make the content easier to look at. "He stood on the steps and watched you fall and didn't move." Harriet said, "He was 2 steps above. By the time he registered what was happening." "You are making an excuse for a man who was watching you and didn't move." Susanna looked at her directly. "Why?" Harriet did not answer, because the answer was complicated in a way that Susanna did not yet have the information to follow. She said instead, "Steyne has been in Bath for a week. Before yesterday. Had you heard anything about why?" Susanna considered this shift in subject with the patience of a woman who had known Harriet for 7 years and understood that the shifts were usually meaningful. "He has property interests in the area," she said. "Something about a mill lease." Henry mentioned it. Henry was Susanna's husband, who knew about mill leases and property interests in the way that men with investments in the county knew about such things incidentally, comprehensively, without always recognizing which details would be relevant to other people. "He has been in and out of the solicitor's office on Milsom Street twice this week." Harriet filed this. She said, "Do you know which solicitor?" Susanna named him. It was not Sir Francis's solicitor, which she had expected, and not Prine's solicitor, which she had also considered. It was a third firm, smaller, with a reputation. She recalled from something Sir Francis had once said, for discretion in financial matters. She thought about Milsom Street and the solicitor with the reputation for discretion and a mill lease that might or might not be the full explanation for a viscount spending a week in Bath in December. She thought about the 15 minutes in the carriage and some of it, and she thought, there is a piece I am not seeing. She saw Steyne 3 times in the following week. In the way that Bath arranged for people to see each other, whether or not they had decided to at a small concert at the assembly rooms, at the pump room on Thursday morning when both of them had come for reasons unrelated to each other, and at a musical evening at the house of a woman named Kral, whose husband was Susanna's husband's cousin, which was the kind of connection that Bath produced in abundance. At the concert they exchanged 12 words across a social group, and she observed that he tracked the conversation without appearing to, which was a skill she recognized because she had it herself. At the pump room they were briefly alone near the far windows for perhaps 4 minutes, and he asked, with the directness she was accumulating data on, how her wrist was. She said it was better. He said he was glad. She said she had been thinking about what he meant by some of it. He looked at her with the contained quality that she now understood was not reserve, but precision, and he said he had thought she might. He did not say anything further. She did not press it. At the musical evening, she was at the piano for a portion of the program she had been asked to play, and had agreed before the events at St. Swithin's had made her social position more complicated than it had been. And afterward, when the guests had moved back to the main room and she was alone for a moment at the instrument, she began to copy out the opening page of a Clementi sonata from the edition on the stand, because she had been meaning to make a copy for one of her students and had her notebook with her, and it seemed efficient. She did not hear Steyne come in. She heard him when he was already at her left shoulder, not close, but close enough to see the page she was copying, and she reacted before she had decided to react. Folding the notebook closed faster than was natural and pulling it toward her, which was a response she could not fully explain, except that the copying had felt private in a way that the playing had not, and his nearness had made it more private, and she did not want him reading it over her shoulder. The fold was too fast. The corner of the page crumpled against the cover. She looked at it and then looked at him. He said, "I was not reading." "I know," she said. "I reacted before I thought." He looked at the notebook and then at her and said nothing about either, which was correct, and also the thing she would have done in his position. She gathered her things to go back to the main room, and she left the notebook on the piano bench when she stood, and she did not realize it until she was already in the doorway. And by then, she was not certain whether to go back for it or leave it, and she left it, because going back for it would have required explaining why she had left it, and she was not ready to explain that either. She was in the hallway putting on her coat when she heard Steyne behind her, and she turned, but he was speaking to the footman and not to her, and she went out into the cold. And it was only in the carriage home, Sir Francis's carriage this time, and Sir Francis beside her, that she thought about the notebook still on the piano bench and about whether Steyne had picked it up. 2 mornings later, she was in her room before breakfast, reviewing her accounts for the month, the private accounts, the locked box accounts, the careful record of what she had and what she still needed when she heard Sir Francis's study door open and then the voice of Beale, his butler, followed by another voice she needed 3 seconds to place. She crossed to her own door and opened it the half-inch that was sufficient, because her hearing was the best instrument she possessed, and she had learned to use it carefully. Steyne was in the entrance hall below. He was saying something to Beale about a document. She could not make out the document. She could make out, from the acoustics of the entrance hall and the particular carrying quality of Steyne's voice when he was being precise, a phrase that rose clearly above the rest. The Thorne debt does not need to go into the main ledger. The private file is sufficient. She stood at the half-inch gap in her door and held very still. The Thorne debt, in his voice, with the casual authority of a man discussing something that had already been arranged, that was already filed. That did not need additional administration because it was already handled. The private file, which meant there was a private file, which meant the debt was in his files, which meant the debt was his. She closed her door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the locked box on the wardrobe shelf and thought about Kessel saying the sum was close but not sufficient and come back in 6 weeks, and about Prine using a debt as an instrument of coercion, and about a man who had caught her on frozen steps and driven her to her door and answered some of it with the patience of a person who was waiting for her to find the rest herself. She thought, I need to go back to Kessel. The office of Phineas Kessel was on a street in the lower part of Bath that had the particular quality of a place that did business without advertising that it did so. The signage was minimal. The entrance was at the side rather than the front, and the hours were by appointment, which Harriet had learned on her first visit and had since worked around by appearing at the same time on the same day of the week until Kessel's clerk understood that she was a regular and showed her in without making her wait. She had been coming here for 3 months. She knew the clerk's name and the arrangement of the furniture and the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard inside the door. She knew that Kessel kept tea on the side table but never offered it, and that the chair on the left was more comfortable than the chair on the right, and that he answered direct questions more reliably than indirect ones. She sat in the left chair and said, "The debt I have been working toward. I want to know its current status." Kessel was a man of perhaps 55, with the quality of someone who had been managing other people's money for long enough that the money had ceased to have any emotional valence for him and was simply a set of figures that moved between containers. He looked at her over the rims of his spectacles and said, "The debt is no longer in my inventory." She had known this was coming and had prepared for it, and still felt it as a physical fact in the chest. When, some weeks ago, how many weeks? He considered the question. 7, he said, approximately. 7 weeks. She had last been here 6 weeks ago, when he had told her to return in 6 weeks with the full sum, which meant the debt had been sold 1 week before that conversation, and he had sat across from her and told her to come back in 6 weeks for a debt he had already sold. She looked at him steadily. She said, "You knew when I came in 6 weeks ago." He did not look away. He said, "I was not at liberty to discuss the transaction. You let me leave, believing I had 6 weeks. I let you leave," he said, "because what you believed about the 6 weeks was your own construction. I did not confirm it." She looked at him for a moment longer. She recognized the distinction he was making, and it was technically accurate, and it was also the distinction of a man who had decided that technical accuracy was sufficient, which was the kind of decision that people made when they had conflicting obligations and resolved the conflict in favor of the one that paid more. She said, "Who bought it?" "I am not at liberty." "The person who bought it, did they come to you? Or did you go to them?" A pause. Kessel picked up his pen and set it down in a slightly different position. "They came to me," he said, "with the specific debt in mind." She filed this. Someone had come to Kessel with the specific debt in mind. 7 weeks ago. Which meant they had known about the debt 7 weeks ago. Which meant they had known about it before she had approached Kessel the first time. Because her first visit had been 9 weeks ago. Or they had found out about it at approximately the same time she had, through a different channel, and had moved faster. She thought about which of those was more likely, and thought the second, and then she thought about what channel a Viscount in Bath would use to learn about a specific moneylender's specific inventory. She said, "The person who purchased it, are they using it?" Kessel looked at her. "In what sense?" "In the sense of presenting it for payment, making demands on the basis of it, using it as an instrument." He was quiet for a moment that was longer than the question required. He said, "No." She said, "Are they holding it?" "To my knowledge," he said, carefully, "it is in a private file and has not been presented anywhere." Private file. She heard the phrase again from above the entrance hall, from the gap in the door, from Steyne's voice at the precise pitch it reached, when he was being specific with a specific person. She looked at Kessel's desk and thought about 7 weeks, and about a man who had caught her on icy steps with the quality of someone who had been watching the steps, and about some of it, and about the locked box in her wardrobe that contained everything she had been able to save, and that was, she now understood, 2 months too late. She said, "Thank you," and stood, and went out into the cold. She walked back to Vane House along the river, which was longer than the direct route, and which she took, because she needed the distance to put what she had in order before she arrived. She had the following: a debt that had been purchased 7 weeks ago by an unidentified buyer who had come to Kessel with the specific debt in mind, who had not presented it or used it as an instrument, and who kept it in a private file. She had a phrase overheard in an entrance hall that used the words Thorne debt and private file in a sentence spoken by Edmund Steyne. She had a man who had said some of it and had not said more, and who had appeared in her social vicinity 3 times in the week since St. Swithin's without explanation, and who had, she now recognized, been in Bath for approximately 7 weeks, the same 7 weeks. She was not certain. She was close to certain, which was not the same thing. And she did not want to proceed on close, because proceeding on close when she was wrong would produce consequences she could not manage. She needed one more piece. She thought about what she knew about Steyne beyond what Sir Francis's misfiled correspondence had told her. She thought about the musical evening and the notebook and the piano bench. And then she thought about something else, a detail she had stored and not yet used, from the pump room conversation with Susanna, about a mill lease and a solicitor on Milsom Street with a reputation for discretion in financial matters. Discretion in financial matters was a specific reputation to have and a specific reason to use a particular firm. Property transactions were not, in her experience, transactions that required discretion. Debt purchases were. She went to Milsom Street. She did not go inside the solicitor's office. She stood across the street for a moment, looking at the building, and she thought about what she could reasonably ask and of whom. She had no standing to inquire about another person's financial transactions, and the solicitor would not tell her in any case. What she could do was confirm the connection, confirm that Steyne had been using this office for something that was not a mill lease, and she thought about how to do that, and came to the answer that was sitting plainly in front of her, which was that she should ask Susanna to ask Henry, because Henry knew about property interests in the county, and would know what kind of transaction would require Milsom Street's particular kind of discretion. And because Susanna could ask Henry in a way that would not require explaining why Harriet wanted to know, she wrote to Susanna that evening. The reply came the following morning. It was 2 sentences, Henry. Says the Milsom Street firm does debt transfers almost exclusively. He was surprised Steyne was using them, since Steyne doesn't usually operate in that market. She folded the letter and put it in the locked box with the month's accounts, and sat for a long time at her writing table, looking at nothing. The concert at the Fenwick House that Thursday was the largest social occasion of that fortnight, and Prine had been there before her, and had positioned himself in the way that Prine always positioned himself centrally, with 2 men she recognized as minor creditors of Sir Francis at his right and left, which was a configuration she recognized as a display of available force rather than a social grouping. She had come with Sir Francis, who had spent the past week being careful with her in the way of a man who suspected he did not have all the relevant information, and was waiting for the moment when she would give it to him. She watched Prine across the room and thought about 7 weeks, and private files, and the locked box, and everything she had assembled that was not yet quite enough. She was near the refreshment table when Prine found her. He came without his flanking creditors, which meant this was not a display. This was a direct conversation, he said, with the pleasant tone she had learned to pass for content rather than register, that he hoped she was recovering well. She said she was. He said he was glad to hear it, and that he had been thinking about the timing of certain announcements, and that he wondered whether she had given additional thought to a date. She said she was still considering. He looked at her. The pleasant tone did not change, but something behind it did a small recalibration, the adjustment of a man who had expected a different answer and was deciding what the new answer told him. He said, still pleasantly, that he understood these decisions required time, and that he hoped here he paused, and the pause had the quality of a man selecting a word with surgical precision. The associations of recent days were not creating undue complication for her, and that he was certain any complication could be managed discreetly if she was open to a practical conversation. She looked at him. She said, "What associations do you mean?" He said, "The Viscount Ashwick has been present in your vicinity on several occasions. I mention it only as an observer. He is in Bath." She said, "We have encountered each other." "Of course." He smiled. "I mention it only because appearances in Bath tend to become stories, and stories have a way of affecting practical arrangements." The smile stayed in place. "I would not want anything to complicate what is between us." She understood what he was doing, and she understood it clearly. He was reminding her that he had something, or believed he had something, and that her behavior affected his willingness to hold it quietly. He was not threatening her. He was indicating that threats were available. She said, "I will let you know about the date," and moved away, and spent the next 40 minutes in a state of focused external calm and internal rapid calculation, because she had just understood 2 things simultaneously: that Prine did not know the debt had changed hands, and that this was information she could use if she had the right instrument to use it with, and that finding that instrument required one more conversation she had been postponing for 10 days. She found Steyne near the window at the end of the main room, which was where he had positioned himself with the consistency of a man who preferred to see the room rather than be in the center of it. She came and stood beside him and looked out at the same view he was looking at, which was the dark garden below the window, and she said, quietly enough that it did not carry, "You purchased a debt from Kessel on Cheap Street 7 weeks ago." A beat of silence. She felt rather than saw him go still. The debt belonged to Sir Francis Vane. she said. Kessel confirms it was sold but will not name the buyer. You were in Bath at the time. You used the Milsom Street firm, which handles debt transfers, for something that was not a mill lease. She paused. I am not asking you to confirm it. I am telling you what I know, so that you understand where I am. He said, after a moment, very quietly, Where are you? I know that Prine has been using a debt as an instrument of coercion, she said. I know that if the debt is no longer in his possession, the coercion has no foundation. I know that the debt went somewhere 7 weeks ago. She turned and looked at him. And I know that you said some of it in a carriage 10 days ago and have not told me the rest. He was looking at her. The contained quality was still there, but she could see, in the quality of his stillness, that she had arrived somewhere he had not expected her to arrive by herself. Or not yet. He said, How did you find the Milsom Street connection? I listened. She said, I have been listening since I was 14. It is the most reliable instrument I have. He was quiet for a moment. She held his gaze and let the silence run, because she had learned that his silences were not evasion, but construction, and interrupting them produced worse answers than waiting. He said, Not here. No, she agreed. Not here. Tomorrow. He said, Ashwick Manor. If you can manage it without Sir Francis. She said, I can manage it. She looked back at the dark garden. I have been managing things without Sir Francis for some time, he said, after a pause that had the quality of a man deciding whether to say the next thing. I know that too. She looked at him. She said, How much do you know? And he said, quietly, with something in his face that was not quite an answer and not quite an apology, but sat between them with the weight of something that had been held for a while, most of it. Ashwick Manor in December had the quality of a house that had been built for a larger life than it was currently containing high ceilings, wide corridors, rooms that opened into each other in the manner of a house designed for company, now occupied by one man and a household staff who had learned to manage the scale without filling it. She arrived at 10:30 in Sir Francis's second carriage, having told Sir Francis she was calling on Susanna, which was not entirely untrue since she had told Susanna she was going, and Susanna had said, with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was being asked to provide, I will mention to Henry that you came for tea. Beale admitted her without the flicker of a reaction that would indicate her arrival was unusual, which told her Steyne had prepared him, which told her Steyne had been certain she would come. She was shown not to the drawing room, but to a smaller room off the main corridor, a sitting room that had the quality of a room in daily use rather than occasional use. Books on the table, and a fire that had been lit some time ago and was burning, well, rather than recently started. She noted these details the way she noted all details, which was without appearing to note them. Steyne was already there when she came in. He was standing at the window with a cup of tea he had apparently forgotten he was holding, and he turned when she entered, with the expression of a man who had spent the morning deciding how to begin a conversation and had not fully resolved the question. She sat in the chair nearest the fire and looked at him and waited, because it was his house and his conversation to begin, and she had done enough arriving at things first for 1 week. He set the cup down on the side table and came to sit in the chair across from her. He said, Without preliminary, I want to tell you the sequence. All of it. Not the structural version. She said, I know the difference. A corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile. The near territory of one. He said, I know you do. He looked at the fire. Kessel approached me. Not the other way. He had a client who had been making inquiries about a specific debt, a debt he described only by its general characteristics, a medium-term obligation originating with a peer's household in Bath. He said the client was not yet in a position to purchase, but was accumulating toward it, and he wanted to know whether I had interest in acquiring the debt before the client could. He paused. I asked him who the client was. He said he was not at liberty. I asked him who held the debt originally. He said Prine. She was watching his face. She said, "And you knew what Prine was?" He looked at her directly. I knew what Prine was. He had the flatness of a man describing a known quantity. Prine acquires debt to use as leverage. That is his method and his business. It is not illegal, and it is not uncommon, and I have no standing to object to it in general. Pause. In this particular case I had standing, because Sir Francis Vane's household was involved, and I know what Sir Francis's household contains. She held herself very still. He said, I knew Kessel's client was trying to buy the debt out from under Prine. I did not know who the client was, but I knew they were accumulating Kessel's word, which meant they were not a person of large means who could simply purchase it outright. I knew the pace was too slow for Prine not to act first. He looked at his hands. So I bought it. She said, when you say you had standing because of Sir Francis, because of Sir Francis's household, he said, which includes his ward. He looked up. Yes. The fire made a small sound. She looked at it for a moment rather than at him, because she needed a moment to put what she had just heard into the structure of everything else and verify that it fit where she thought it fit. It fit precisely, she said. You knew I was the client. I worked it out, he said. Not immediately, Kessel said, accumulating, which suggested regular deposits rather than a lump sum, which suggested income rather than capital. The debt was Sir Francis's, which meant the most likely person with both knowledge of it and motivation to resolve it without Sir Francis's knowledge was his ward. He paused. I confirmed it when I saw you at the pump room in November. You had the quality of a woman in the middle of a calculation. I recognized it. She said, you recognized a specific quality. I spend a great deal of time in the middle of calculations. He said, I know what it looks like on someone's face. She absorbed this. She said, carefully you bought the debt. You did not tell me. You allowed me to continue trying to accumulate the sum for 7 more weeks. He did not look away from that. He said, yes. Kessel told me to come back in 6 weeks. I know. He told me the same day. Something in his expression shifted, not quite discomfort, but the acknowledgement of something he had been sitting with. I should have stopped that. I did not, because I was not certain how to tell you the debt was already purchased without telling you who had purchased it. And I was not ready to tell you that yet. She said, why not? He looked at the fire. She waited. Outside, somewhere on the grounds. One of the stable hands was doing something with the gravel on the drive, a slow, rhythmic sound, distant enough to be almost imperceptible. She counted the rhythm of it and let it fill the silence and let him find the answer at his own pace, because she had enough information now to know that the answers he found at his own pace were more accurate than the ones he produced under pressure. He said, because you were handling it. He said it quietly, with the quality of a man saying something he had not expected to need to say aloud. You had found the problem and devised a solution and were executing it. The solution was slower than the threat required, which was the only flaw in it, and I could address the flaw without disrupting the rest. He looked at her. I did not want to tell you I had purchased the debt, because telling you would have meant you knew you had been rescued before you, finished rescuing yourself. And I. He stopped. He started again. I thought that would matter to you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the locked box and the 3 months and the piano lessons and the careful accounting, and she thought about what it felt like to be nearly there and to have the ground shift under you, not through failure, but through someone else's faster action. She thought about the steps at St. Swithin's and the question not, "Are you all right?" but "Are you hurt?" And about a man who made distinctions because he believed the distinctions mattered, and about what it meant that he had made this one. She said, "It mattered." He said, "I know. You were right that it mattered." She kept her voice even. "You were wrong not to tell me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Those 2 things are both true at the same time." "Yes," he said, again, with the tone of a man who has had some time to arrive at that conclusion and finds it accurate and not comfortable. "I am aware of that." She looked at the fire. She thought about most of it from the previous evening and about how much the most was and what the remainder contained. She said, "What else?" He was quiet for a moment. She heard the gravel sound again, farther away now, moving toward the stable. He said, "Prine knows the debt changed hands. He has known for approximately 3 weeks." She went still. "He found out through his solicitor," Steyne said, "who made inquiries at Kessel's office and was told the debt had been transferred. He does not know who holds it now." He looked at her. "That is why he approached you at the Fenwick concert. He is not certain whether his instrument is still available to him, and he was testing whether you behaved like a woman who knew." She thought about Prine's pleasant tone and the surgical pause before associations and the smile that had stayed in place while the thing behind it recalibrated. She thought he was reading me and I was reading him, and neither of us showed the other what we had. She said, "He concluded I did not know." "Almost certainly," Steyne said. "If he had concluded otherwise, the conversation would have been different." She said, "And now?" "Now," he said, "we are at a point where Prine has been using a debt he no longer controls as an instrument of coercion, which is a specific kind of fraud, and where that fraud is provable if the right documents are placed before the right people." He looked at her steadily. "I have the transfer receipt from Kessel. It is dated 7 weeks ago. It is dated before you agreed to the betrothal. If Prine presented the debt to you as a reason to agree, and the debt was no longer his to present at that time, then the agreement was obtained by fraudulent representation." She heard the full shape of it. She said, "The betrothal is void. Legally, yes. With the right representation." He paused. "But presenting that case requires disclosing that I hold the debt, which requires explaining why I hold it, which requires a conversation about my reasons that I am not certain Sir Francis is ready to have with me." She thought about Sir Francis. She thought about the misfiled correspondence and 11 years of escalating coldness, and the final letter "I consider the matter closed," and the acquaintance equally so. She said, "What happened between you and Sir Francis?" "The original dispute." He looked at the fire. He said, "My father arranged a business partnership between our families. A shipping venture. Sir Francis invested. I found, when I reviewed the accounts shortly after my father died, that the venture's prospectus had contained figures that were optimistic in a way that my father knew was not accurate." He paused. "I dissolved the partnership and returned Sir Francis's investment. I did not explain why, because explaining why required me to describe what my father had done. And my father had been dead for 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. "Sir Francis interpreted the dissolution as evidence that I considered the venture a failure of his judgment rather than my father's integrity. He wrote to me. I did not write back, because I could not explain without explaining, and I was not ready to do that." She looked at him. She said, "You did the right thing and did not explain it, and the silence was read as an insult. He said, "Yes." She thought about what that cost, and how long it had been costing him. She thought about two men who had both been in possession of incomplete information for 11 years, and had organized their understanding of each other around the gaps. She said, "He needs to know. I know he does. He will not accept it from you alone." She said, "Not after 11 years. He will think it is a reconstruction." She looked at the fire, but there would be documentation. Your father's original prospectus, the corrected figures, the dissolution papers. Yes, he looked at her. "I have them," she said. "Then we need 2 conversations. One about Prine and the fraud. One about your father and the partnership." She met his gaze. "Not the same conversation. In the right order." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had been building data on since the churchyard, and she saw in it now what she had not had enough information to read before, not just assessment but something quieter and less manageable than assessment. The expression of a man who had been handling things alone for a long time and had just been told, in practical and specific terms, that he did not need to. He said, "Which order?" "Prine first," she said. "Sir Francis needs to be on the same side as us before he is asked to revise 11 years of understanding. The shared problem makes the second conversation possible." She paused. "I can bring Sir Francis to the first conversation if you tell me when." He said, "How will you get him there without telling him you are bringing him to meet me?" She said, "I will tell him I have information about the betrothal that requires a solicitor's witness and that he needs to come." She held his gaze. "He will come. He always comes when I ask him to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow, if Hartley can manage it. Make it the afternoon." She said, "I need the morning." He nodded. She stood and picked up her coat from the chair back, and she was at the door when he said, "From behind her, Miss Thorne." She turned. He was still in the chair, and his expression had the quality she had seen once before. At the concert, the near territory of something that was not quite said yet. He said, "When Kessel told me there was a client accumulating." He stopped. He tried again. "I should have found a way to tell you. Earlier than this. That what you were doing was another stop." He looked at the fire, then back at her. "I should have found a way." She looked at him across the room. She thought about everything he had just told her, and about the order he had chosen to tell it in, not the structural version, but the real one, with the discomfort left in, and she said, "You found a way today." He said, "It took me too long." She said, "Yes, it did." She paused. "We are both going to have to do better at telling people things." She said it as a statement that included herself, because it did, and because saying it only about him would have been less accurate than the situation required. She saw him understand that it included her, and she saw what that did to his expression, which was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. She went out into the corridor and past Beale, and out into the cold December air and into the carriage. And she sat with her hands in her lap, and thought about tomorrow afternoon, and the order of conversations, and the documents that were going to be needed. And she thought about a locked box in her wardrobe that contained 3 months of piano lessons and careful arithmetic. And she thought that the arithmetic had not been wasted, not because it had bought the debt, which it had not, but because it had made her the person who could read the situation she was sitting in, and that was worth more than the debt. And she thought Steyne understood that, and she thought that was the beginning of something. Hartley's office was on a quiet street near the Abbey, in a building that had the gravity of a place where things were settled, rather than disputed, different from the charged atmosphere of a magistrate's room, more like the room where the document that ends the dispute is finally signed. It smelled of beeswax and coal, and the very particular cold of a stone building that had been heated for perhaps 2 hours and had not yet decided whether to accept it. Sir Francis arrived with Harriet, which had required a conversation in the carriage on the way over that had been the most concentrated and most incomplete exchange she had ever conducted with her guardian. She had told him there were documents about the betrothal he needed to see, and that there was a solicitor involved, and that she needed him to come without asking her for more than that until they arrived. He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was being asked to trust something he could not yet see the shape of, and then he had said, "All right, my dear," and had asked no further questions, which was one of the things she had always loved about him. Prine was not there when they arrived, which was by design. Hartley had sent him a separate notice requesting his presence regarding a matter pertaining to the betrothal, at a time 30 minutes after Sir Francis and Harriet were due, which was enough time to establish the situation before Prine arrived to contest it. Steyne was there. He was standing near the window when they came in, and Sir Francis stopped in the doorway for one visible moment. And then something in Sir Francis's face did the thing that old griefs do when they are surprised, not softening, exactly, but briefly exposed before the management descended again. He said, "Ashwick," Steyne said. "Sir Francis." They were exactly the sounds of two people saying each other's names when they have not said them in 11 years, and the names have accumulated weight. Harriet sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She said, "I am going to tell you what I know, in the order I found it out, and then Viscount Ashwick is going to add what he knows. And then Hartley is going to explain the legal situation. I would ask that you let all of that happen before you respond." She looked at Sir Francis, who had sat down across from her and whose expression was the most careful she had seen it. She said, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I was trying to solve it first." Sir Francis said, "Quietly, I know." She told him about the misfiled folder and the debt and the locked box, and she saw his face move through something private and difficult when she described the 3 months of piano lessons and the careful sum and the slow accumulation. And she did not stop for it, because stopping would have made it harder to finish. She told him about Kessel and the 6 weeks and the conversation at the Fenwick concert and what Prine's pleasant tone had contained. She told him about the transfer, that the debt was no longer in Prine's possession at the time Prine had used it as an instrument of coercion. She told him who held it now. She did not look at Steyne while she said it. She looked at Sir Francis. Sir Francis looked at Steyne. It was the look of a man reorganizing a large structure in a short amount of time, and it was not comfortable to watch. And she let it run without intervening, because intervening would have taken something from both of them that was theirs to have. Steyne said, "Into the silence. The transfer receipt is dated 7 weeks ago, 3 weeks before Miss Thorne agreed to the betrothal. Hartley has reviewed it." Hartley confirmed this. He placed the receipt on the table, a single sheet. Kessel's firm hand. The date in the upper right. The notation of the debt's particulars and the transfer price in the body. He said that in his view, a betrothal obtained by presenting a debt instrument as a source of coercion, when the presenting party no longer held that instrument at the time of presentation, constituted fraudulent inducement, and that a betrothal obtained by fraudulent inducement was not a valid contract, and that he had prepared a brief statement to that effect, which he was prepared to present to whatever authority Mr. Prine wished to engage. Sir Francis looked at the receipt. He looked at the date. He said, to Steyne, with the careful quality of a man testing a surface before he steps on it, "You purchased it to remove it from Prine." Steyne said, "Yes." "Why?" A pause. Steyne looked at Sir Francis across the table with the expression of a man who has decided, before this conversation, how much truth he is going to put into it, and has decided on all of it. He said, "Because Prine intended to use it against your household, and because I had reason to believe someone in your household was trying to address the situation and needed more time than they had." He paused. "I should have done it more directly. I chose to act without disclosing my involvement, which caused complications I did not adequately anticipate." He held Sir Francis's gaze. "That was a mistake. I am telling you that plainly." Sir Francis was quiet for a moment. He said, "You have held this debt for 7 weeks." "Yes, and done nothing with it." "No." Sir Francis looked at the receipt again. He said, "With the quality of a man asking a question he has been waiting 11 years to ask, and has only now found the correct form for it. The partnership, when you dissolved it, you returned the full investment." Steyne said, "Yes, without explanation. Without sufficient explanation." Steyne said, "I corrected the wrong thing, and failed to explain what the wrong thing was. I have documentation of what my father's prospectus contained, and what the accurate figures were. I should have shown it to you then. He stopped. He said, "More simply, I was not ready to show it then." Sir Francis looked at him for a long moment. She watched her guardian's face, and watched 11 years of organized grievance encounter the possibility that the organization was wrong. And she held herself very still because this was not her moment to manage or fill. It was theirs. Prine arrived at that point, which was 31 minutes after the agreed time, and came in with the slightly proprietorial air of a man who assumed that rooms waited for him. He took in Steyne and Sir Francis and the receipt on the table and Hartley's folder, and his expression went through the same rapid calculation she had watched on the church steps, options being priced in real time and settled, into the pleasant composure that was his most reliable instrument. Hartley said, "Before Prine could speak, Mr. Prine, I have asked you here regarding the matter of your betrothal to Miss Harriet Thorne, and specifically regarding the basis on which Miss Thorne's agreement to that betrothal was obtained." Prine looked at the receipt. He looked at Hartley. He said, with the pleasantness entirely in place, "I am not certain I understand the nature of this gathering," Harriet said, from across the table. "Then I will explain it." She kept her voice level and her hands flat on the table, and looked at Prine with the attention she gave to documents she had finished reading and understood completely. "You presented my guardian's debt to me as a reason to agree to the betrothal. You implied that agreeing was the only way to prevent the debt from being called. That was the instrument you used to obtain my agreement." She paused. "The debt had been transferred out of your possession 3 weeks before you had that conversation with me. You presented an instrument you no longer controlled. That is fraud." Prine's pleasant expression did not break. She gave him credit for that. He said, "I was not aware the transfer had occurred at the time of our conversation." She said, "Your solicitor made inquiries at Kessel's office approximately 3 weeks after the transfer. Your solicitor informed you." She held his gaze. "Hartley has a record of those inquiries." A silence. Prine looked at Hartley, who opened the folder and produced a second document, a copy of a letter from Kessel's clerk, confirming that an inquiry had been received from a firm she recognized as Prine's, and that the inquiry had been answered with confirmation that the debt had been transferred. The date was 4 weeks ago, which was 1 week before Prine had spoken to her at the Fenwick concert about the management of appearances. Prine said, "This is a considerable," Sir Francis said. "No." He said it the way he said things when he had finished listening and was done. He said it with the quality of a man who has had 11 years of a wait he did not fully understand and has just put it down and does not intend to pick it up again. You obtained my ward's agreement under false pretenses, and you have now been shown the documentation that establishes that fact before a solicitor and 2 witnesses. Hartley will prepare the statement dissolving the betrothal. You will not contest it." He looked at Prine with the expression she had seen on him perhaps twice in 8 years, the expression behind the careful management. The face of the man underneath the guardian. "If you contest it, we will present this documentation in whatever forum you choose. I would advise against that." Prine looked at the receipt. He looked at Hartley's folder. He looked at Sir Francis, and at Steyne, who had said nothing since Prine arrived, and whose silence had, in the accumulated pressure of the room, the quality of a thing that could become more than silence if called upon to do so. Prine said, "I will need time to consult my solicitor." Hartley said, "Of course. The statement will be filed at the end of the week regardless. You are welcome to have your solicitor review it." Prine left. He left with the pleasant expression still in place and the carriage of a man who was already calculating the next arrangement. Because that was what Prine was. And a man like that did not stop calculating simply because one arrangement had failed. She watched him go and thought he will find another instrument in another situation, and someone else will have to notice. She hoped they would notice. She thought, on the evidence of this week, that noticing was a learnable skill. Hartley went to prepare the statement. Sir Francis and Steyne were left at the table, and she was between them. And what happened next was both shorter and longer than she had prepared for. Sir Francis said, "The partnership documents. Will you show them to me?" Steyne said, "Yes." Sir Francis said, "Not today." "No," Steyne agreed, "not today." Sir Francis looked at his hands on the table. He said, with the care of a man choosing words for a thing that does not have established language, "I was angry for a long time about something I did not fully understand." He paused. "I am not yet ready to say more than that." Steyne said, "That is enough for now." Sir Francis looked at him. Something passed between them that she did not try to name, because naming it would have reduced it, and it was larger than anything she currently had a name for. Sir Francis stood and said he would wait in the outer room while Hartley finished, and he went out, and she was alone with Steyne for the first time since Ashwick Manor. She said, "He will come around." Steyne looked at the table. He said, "I know." "Ah, pause. I did not know that this morning." She looked at him. She said, "You told him directly. About the partnership. You said the second conversation had to happen." He looked up. "You said the shared problem makes it possible." "I said that yesterday." "I know." He held her gaze. "I have been thinking about the order of things since yesterday." She said, "And," he said, with the quality of a man who has found the right words and is going to say them plainly rather than dress them, "the order I have been operating in doing things without saying them has not produced the results I would have hoped for. In several areas." He paused. "I think I need to change the order." She said, "To what?" He said, "Say first, then do." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to continue being in the same room as you when there are problems to solve. I would like that to be a settled thing rather than a series of occasions." He paused. "That is the saying part. I am aware it requires a response before I can consider it done." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the locked box, and the 3 months and the steps, and "Are you hurt?" and most of it, and the notebook left on the piano bench and the questions she had been assembling since the churchyard, and the answers she had been accumulating since, and she thought about a man who had bought a debt to give her time and had not told her, and about how those 2 facts sat together, the kindness and the error, both real, neither cancelling the other, and she said, I would like that too. She paused. On the condition that we both improve at the saying part. He said, That seems fair. She said, It is very fair. It is possibly the fairest arrangement I have been offered this month. He looked at her, and she saw the near territory of a smile arrive, and this time continue past the near territory into the actual, which was the first time she had seen it reach its conclusion. And it changed his face in a way that she filed away carefully because it was data she intended to keep. Hartley returned with the statement. She signed it. Steyne signed as witness. They went out into the December afternoon, which was cold and pale and entirely ordinary. Bath going about its business with the indifference of a city that had not paused for any of it. Sir Francis was in the carriage. She told Steyne she would send word about when to bring the partnership documents, and he said he would wait, and she got into the carriage, and Sir Francis said nothing until they had turned the first corner, and then he said, He is not what I remembered. She said, No, I do not think he is what you remembered for quite some time. Sir Francis looked out the window. He said, after a pause, You are not what I expected either. When you were 14, he said it with the warmth of a man who has been surprised in a direction he approves of. I am glad of that. She said, So am I. That evening she went to the music room and sat at the piano, and this time she played the Clementi Sonata, from memory, because the notebook was not here. She played it through twice, and was at the beginning of the third time when she heard the door and turned and Steyne was there, which was not possible because he had not been invited, and Sir Francis had not told her he was coming. He had something in his hand. He held it out as he crossed the room, a notebook. Her notebook, the one she had left on the piano bench at the musical evening, and he set it on the music stand without a word and looked at her and waited. She looked at the notebook. The corner that had crumpled when she had folded it too fast had been smoothed as much as paper allowed, not erased. The crease was still there, but attended to. The fold going with it rather than against it. She said, You kept it. He said, I meant to return it. He said it in the exact register he had used about the debt, the same tone, the same awareness of the echo. And then I did not. For a while. She said, How long is a while? He said, Since the musical evening. She opened the notebook to the first page. She set it on the music stand, beside where the Clementi would have been. She said, Sit down. She turned back to the keys. I am going to play the rest of it. She heard him settle in the chair by the window, the chair that faced the piano, the one with the slightly worn armrest where someone had sat many times before, and she put her hands on the keys and played. And the room filled with the sound of it, and outside the December, dark was complete, and the frost was back on the windows, and Bath was going about its evening, and none of that was relevant to anything happening in this room. The notebook stayed on the music stand. Neither of them moved it when the playing was done, and in the morning it was still there, in the room that was made for sound and had had some tonight, which was how it was supposed to be used, and which was both of them understood this without saying it, because some things are understood before they are said how it would be used again. You just spent an hour with a woman who spent 3 months teaching piano lessons and keeping a locked box and getting within 2 months of solving her own problem, and a man who bought the debt she was trying to buy, not to use it, not to hold it over her, but to give her time she did not know she had been given, because he understood that what she was doing mattered, and he did not want to take it from her. He was wrong not to tell her. He knew he was wrong. He told her so, directly, which is rarer than it should be. If this is your kind of story, slow, earned, resolved by receipts and dated documents, and 2 people who learned to say the thing before they did the thing, you know what to do, like this. Share it with someone who deserves a longer story. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And ring the bell if you want us in your feed without the algorithm deciding for you. Here is the question for the comments. Steyne bought the debt to give Harriet time to finish what she had started, but by not telling her. He let her spend 7 more weeks accumulating money for a problem he had already solved. She told him he was wrong. He agreed. But here is the harder question: if he had told her immediately, would she have trusted him, or did she need to find it out herself? In the order she found it. To believe that what he did was what he said it was. Tell us where you land. We will see you next time.